The night Corrine heard her son sing again, she almost dropped her phone. It wasn't a real song, just three notes, hummed low and soft, barely louder than the refrigerator running in the kitchen below. But she froze at the top of the stairs, one hand on the wall. Her Owen, who had not made a single voluntary sound in 14 months, was singing. She didn't go in. She stood there in the dark hallway of their Boston townhouse, still wearing her coat from the office, listening. Three notes. A pause. Three notes again. She pulled up the security app on her phone. The camera in the playroom showed her son sitting cross-legged on the floor. He was 7 years old and small for his age, with the kind of stillness in his body that doctors called withdrawal, and that Corrine called something she had no word for. He was looking at something off camera. His lips were moving, and then the camera panned slightly. She had set it to wide angle, and she saw a man sitting on the floor across from him, not crouching, not standing over him the way adults did when they wanted to seem approachable. Sitting, fully on the floor, legs folded, elbows resting on his knees, like it was the most natural thing in the world to be on the carpet at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. His name was Elliot? No, wait, that name had been on her roster. She scrolled through her memory. No, his name was Carson Briggs. He had been hired 6 weeks ago as the evening maintenance coordinator for the building, and somehow, through a chain of events involving a burst pipe, a flooded supply closet, and Corrine's regular sitter canceling at 4 in the afternoon, he had ended up watching Owen for 2 hours, while she finished a board call she could not miss. She had paid him double. She had thanked him stiffly. She had fully intended never to let it happen again. And yet here he was, in her house, in the playroom, at 9:30 at night, and her son was singing. Corrine Aldwell had not always been the kind of woman who needed a security camera to know what was happening in her own home. There was a time. She could almost locate it, the way you can almost locate a smell from childhood. When she had known exactly the temperature of every room, the mood of every person, the particular quality of silence that meant everything was fine versus the silence that meant something was wrong. That time ended the morning her husband's car went off the bridge on Route 9 in the rain. Marcus had been driving too fast, the way he always drove too fast, and the roads were bad, and the guardrail on the eastern side had been flagged for repair by the county 3 times in the previous 2 years and repaired 0 times. She would learn all of this later. She would spend 6 months learning it, piece by piece, because that's what Corrine did. She gathered information, she built cases, she found the load-bearing wall and pushed. What she couldn't push past was Owen. Owen had been in the car. He had been buckled into his booster seat in the back, and he had been retrieved from the water by a man who happened to be crossing the bridge on foot, who had climbed down the embankment and broken the rear window with a rock from the riverbed and pulled a 6-year-old boy out of a half-submerged sedan. The man had performed CPR on the bank while someone else called 911. He had stayed until the paramedics arrived, and then at some point between the ambulance loading, Owen, and the police cordoning off the scene, he had simply walked away. Owen survived. Owen came home. Owen did not speak again for 8 months, and when he finally did, it was only to answer direct questions, and only when pressed, and it came out flat and colorless, like a reading exercise, not like a voice. The therapist said trauma. The neurologist said nothing structural. The child psychologist said, give him time. Corrine gave him time and kept working because the alternative, stopping, thinking, feeling all of it at once, was not something she could afford. She was the CFO of Meridian Capital, 41 years old, answerable to 17 board members and several $100 million in assets under management. She did not stop. She hired a rotating cast of sitters and child psychologists and occupational therapists. She made Owen's favorite foods even when he didn't eat them. She read to him every night, a chapter at a time, from a dog-eared copy of a book about a mouse who built a house, which had been his favorite before, and sat in the chair beside his bed even when he turned his face to the wall. She was doing everything right. She knew she was doing everything right. She just couldn't find the frequency he was on anymore. Carson Briggs had come to the Aldwell building, one of 3 mid-rise residential properties in Corrine's personal real estate portfolio, through a temp agency that specialized in facilities staffing. His resume was 3 lines long. Previous experience, building maintenance, school custodial, 1 year at a community rec center. No college degree. References available. He was 36. He had a daughter named Willa, 4 years old, who he brought to work on the days his regular childcare fell through, which was more often than his supervisor preferred and less often than it probably happened. Corrine knew about Willa because she had once stepped off the elevator on the ground floor to find a small girl in rain boots very seriously mopping a section of hallway tile while her father worked on a leaking pipe junction 10 feet away. "She's learning," Carson had said without embarrassment. "She likes to help." Corrine had looked at the small girl mopping. She had thought of Owen, who used to like to help, who used to drag a kitchen stool to the counter and insist on breaking the eggs himself. "She's doing a good job," Corrine said, and took the stairs. She had not thought much about Carson Briggs after that, in the way that Corrine did not think much about the people who existed in the peripheral spaces of her life: maintenance staff, building managers, the man at the dry cleaner who always had her order ready 10 minutes early. She noticed competence. She filed it. She moved on. Then the pipe burst on the 14th floor and the sitter canceled, and the board call started in 11 minutes. And Carson Briggs was the only person in the building who happened to be in the right hallway at the wrong time. "I can't pay you enough for this," Corrine said, already walking toward her office. "You can pay me $30, he said. "Owen and I will be fine." She had turned back to look at him then, because something in the way he said it, not, "He'll be fine," or "Don't worry, I've got it," but "Owen and I will be fine," struck her as different, like he was including Owen in the assessment. Like Owen's state was something he had already read and accounted for. But the call was starting. She went. When she came out 2 hours later, Owen was asleep on the couch with a blanket tucked around him, and Carson was sitting in the kitchen drinking a glass of water and looking at something on his phone. "He fell asleep around 8:30, Carson said. "He didn't want dinner." "I didn't push it." Corrine looked at her son. The crease between his brows, the one that had appeared after the accident and hadn't left, was smooth. He looked, for the first time in a long time, like he was simply sleeping and not enduring. "He talked to you?" she asked. "A little." Carson stood, rinsed his glass. "He showed me a puzzle he was working on. He didn't finish it, but he got pretty far." She waited for more. He didn't offer more. She paid him and he left, and she stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at the puzzle on the coffee table. It was a 500-piece landscape, a mountain lake, blue-green water, the kind of thing she'd bought because a therapist suggested scenic imagery. Owen had not touched it in 3 weeks. He had gotten to the water. Someone had helped him with the water. The second time it happened was 2 weeks later, and it was not an emergency. Corrine told herself it was an emergency. The quarterly report, the analyst call, the 2 associates who had sent panic emails simultaneously about evaluation discrepancy. But if she was honest, and she tried always to be honest with herself, she could have managed it differently. She could have called the agency. She could have asked her neighbor, who had offered twice. She called down to the maintenance line instead. Carson said yes the way he always seemed to say yes. Not reluctantly, not with visible calculation, just a straightforward affirmative that assumed the thing was doable and he would do it. This time when she finished her call, she came out to find them in the living room. Carson was on his back on the floor, knees bent, using his hands to make shapes on the ceiling with the light from a flashlight. Owen was sitting up beside him, watching. "That one's a dog," Carson said. Owen looked at the shape. He tilted his head. "More like a rabbit," Owen said. It was the most unprompted thing she had heard him say in 14 months. She backed into the hallway and stood there with her hand over her mouth and did not make a sound. She did not ask Carson about it directly. She was not sure why. Maybe because whatever was happening felt fragile, like a bird that would flush if you moved too fast. Maybe because she was afraid of what he would say, which was probably that Owen had just needed someone to sit on the floor with him. And that was a thing she had never done, because sitting on the floor was not in her repertoire, not anymore, not since Marcus. She started watching the security footage instead, not obsessively. Once a day, in the evenings, after Owen was in bed, she would scroll through the timestamps while she ate dinner, standing at the kitchen counter, and she would watch the 30, 40, sometimes 60 minutes when Carson Briggs sat with her son and did nothing in particular. He didn't try. That was the thing. He didn't have the targeted cheerfulness of Owen's therapists, the deliberate calm of the child psychologist, the studied patience of the rotating sitters who had all read the same articles and deployed the same strategies. He just was there. He brought a deck of cards once and played solitaire on the floor and waited to see if Owen would ask about it. Owen asked about it on the third visit. He brought a book about birds once and left it on the coffee table and said nothing about it. Owen picked it up 20 minutes later. He had figured out, without being told, that Owen did not respond to being approached. He had to approach on his own terms, in his own time. How did you know that? She thought, watching the footage. How did you know? She found out on a Thursday night in November. She had come home early, genuinely early, not crisis rerouted early, and she was standing in the kitchen doorway when she heard Carson talking in the playroom. His voice was low and she could only catch pieces of it through the half-open door. The same for a while, he was saying. After her mom died. Willa didn't cry, she just got quiet. People kept saying she was too young to understand, but she understood. She understood everything. A pause. She still doesn't like loud places, he said. We skip the fireworks. We sit on the back steps and I describe what they look like. She says it's better that way. Owen said something Corrine couldn't hear. Yeah, Carson said. It gets easier. Not faster, just easier. Corrine set down her bag very carefully on the kitchen counter and did not move for a long time. His wife was dead. His daughter had gone quiet. He had sat on back steps describing fireworks to a child who couldn't face the noise, and he had done it without calling it loss, without framing it as tragedy, just as something they did. A thing they had built to replace the thing that broke. She thought about Owen saying more like a rabbit and felt something give way in her chest. The problem with Meridian Capital, and it was a problem that had existed for 18 months before Corrine finally looked at it directly, was not the returns. The returns were fine. The structure was fine. The public face of the firm was, as it had always been, impeccable. The problem was the accident report. Marcus had worked as an external consultant for Meridian before Corrine was CFO, before she was even at the firm. He had flagged the Route 9 bridge in a municipal infrastructure assessment 4 years before his death. The report had been part of a broader county contract, and it had been submitted, and it had been received, and it had been filed by the county. But Meridian's legal team had been quietly involved in a parallel process, a liability assessment for a development project near the same corridor, and somewhere in the chain of that process, a junior associate had noted the bridge flag, and someone above them had decided it was not information that needed to surface in the development documentation. It was not criminal. It was almost certainly not criminal. But it was a decision made by people who had access to information that might have saved her husband's life. Information about a bridge they knew was structurally compromised, and they had made a choice about what to do with it, and they had made that choice quietly. Corrine had found the file 8 months ago. She had not done anything about it yet, because doing something about it meant doing something about Meridian. And Meridian was what she had, while Owen was still finding his way back. It was the structure that held the rest of it up. But she had known for 8 months. And knowing it had changed the temperature of every meeting, every briefing, every quarterly report. She sat in rooms with men who had known and said nothing, and she smiled and spoke and executed, and the distance between who she was inside and who she was in those rooms had been growing for 8 months like a crack in a foundation. She asked Carson to stay late one evening in early December. Owen was asleep. She made coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen table, and she asked him how his wife had died. He didn't seem surprised by the question. Car accident, he said. 3 years ago. Icy road, bad visibility, she was on her way to work. He said it the way people say things they have said many times, not without feeling, but without the rawness of recent grief. It had become a fact, a piece of his shape. I'm sorry, Corrine said. Me too. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. For a long time, I was angry. At the road conditions, at the city, at the other driver who kept going. Then eventually, I was just sad. Anger takes a lot of maintenance. She looked at him. What did you do with it, the anger? He thought about it. I showed up, he said, for Willa. Every day I just showed up, and somewhere in the showing up it started to matter more than the anger. Corrine looked down at her coffee. I found something, she said, at work. Something about the accident that took my husband. She had not said this to anyone. Not her attorney, not her therapist, not her sister who called every Sunday from Austin. People who work for me knew something. Something that might have... She stopped. I don't know what to do with it. Carson was quiet for a moment. Do you know what the right thing is? He asked. Yes. Then you know what to do with it. It was not the most sophisticated advice she had ever received. It was not nuanced or legally considered or strategically framed, but it sat in her chest and stayed there, the way simple things sometimes do, like a piece of furniture moved to exactly the right place. She gave herself until January. In January, she requested a private meeting with Meridian's board chair, a man named Gerald Foss, who had been in the industry for 40 years and who she had always respected and who she now could barely look at. She presented the file. She presented what she had found. She told him she intended to bring it to the county oversight committee and that she intended to cooperate fully with whatever review followed. He told her she was making a mistake. He told her the firm would not survive the exposure. He reminded her what she stood to lose. I know what I stand to lose, she said. She resigned effective immediately and filed the complaint that afternoon. The review took 3 months. It did not destroy Meridian. Gerald had been right that the liability was legally ambiguous, but it produced a settlement with the county, a formal correction of the development documentation, and the quiet departure of 4 senior partners who had been involved in the original decision. It also produced, in the accounting of Corrine's personal and professional life, a kind of wreckage she had been half expecting. She lost her seat on 2 advisory boards. She lost 3 professional relationships she had believed were friendships. She lost the particular feeling of being protected by her position, which she had not known she was relying on until it was gone. She gained. She wasn't sure yet what she gained. It was too new. It was like a room with the furniture removed. The dimensions were still revealing themselves. It was a Wednesday in March when she came home to find Carson in the playroom with Owen, and Owen was teaching him something. She stopped in the doorway. Owen had a deck of cards spread on the floor in front of him. The same deck Carson had brought weeks ago, and he was explaining a game in careful, detailed language, the kind of language he had used before, the language of a child who assumed the world was interested in what he had to say and wanted to make sure he explained it correctly. Carson was listening, not performing listening, actually listening, nodding at the right moments, asking one question and then waiting for the full answer. You have to remember what the other person put down, Owen said. That's the whole game. That's how you win. So it's a memory game, Carson said. Owen considered this. It's more like a paying attention game, he said. Carson looked up then and saw Corrine in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her for a moment, and his face was... She didn't have a precise word for it. Quiet. Like someone who had witnessed something they weren't going to comment on because commenting would diminish it. She pressed her back against the doorframe and listened to her son explain the rules of a card game, and she thought, this is what it sounds like when something comes back. She told Carson what had happened with Meridian in April, on the back steps of the building, while Willa and Owen played in the small courtyard garden. She told him about the file, about the meeting, about the settlement, about the wreckage. He listened without interrupting, which was a thing she had come to understand was rare and which he did naturally, the way some people breathe evenly under pressure. Are you okay? He asked when she finished. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in 6 months. I'll remember. She looked at him. The afternoon light was flat and gray, that particular Boston March light that couldn't decide if it was winter or spring. Willa was trying to convince Owen to look at a worm she had found. Owen was crouching down to examine it with the same careful attention he gave the card game. She's good with him, Corrine said. He's good with her, Carson said. He figured out she needs to be the one who decides things. He lets her lead. Corrine watched her son and the small girl in the courtyard and thought about the months she had spent trying to lead Owen back, trying to find the right strategy, the right therapist, the right book about birds, and how none of it had been the lever she was looking for. How the lever had been something she couldn't have engineered. A man who knew how to sit on the floor and wait because he had learned it the hard way, for his own reasons, in his own grief. Carson, she said. Yeah. Why did you stay? The first night. You put him to bed, you could have just left. He was quiet for a moment. He was watching Willa crouch down beside Owen and Owen say something that made Willa laugh. Because he reminded me of Willa, he said finally. That first night. He had the same look she had, like the world was too loud and he didn't know how to tell anyone. He paused. I knew what to do with that. In May, Corrine accepted a position as independent financial advisor to a nonprofit restructuring consortium. Less money, more meaning. The kind of work she had told herself for 15 years she didn't have time for. She rented a smaller office. She took Fridays off for the first time in her adult professional life. On the first Friday she took off, she sat on the floor of Owen's playroom and watched him finish the puzzle. The mountain lake, the blue-green water. He had been working on it in pieces for months, returning to it in intervals, and now the last edge pieces were going in, one by one. There, he said. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. It's beautiful, Corrine said. Owen looked at her. You said that about everything. I mean it about everything. He considered this seriously the way he considered most things. Then he picked up one of the remaining pieces. There were 3 left over, which happened sometimes with old puzzles, and turned it in his hands. Carson says the extra pieces are the best part, he said, because it means the picture is bigger than the box. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at her son, this child who had been quiet for so long, who was beginning carefully, on his own terms, in his own time, to speak again. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, the way something grows when it's finally in the right light. He's right, she said. Owen set the piece down on top of the finished puzzle. Then he looked up at her. Can Willa come over on Saturday, he asked. Yes, Corrine said. Absolutely yes. He nodded, satisfied, and began carefully breaking the puzzle apart so he could start again. She watched him and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say, because some things don't need annotation. They just need to be witnessed, quietly, by the right person, at the right time.